Today, I'm going to walk you through the 3 phases of this ritual, and at the end, I'm going to show you pictures of what a successful Shokusen Butsu looks like. However, be warned, the images are very disturbing, so viewer discretion is advised. Buddhists believe that human life is a constant cycle of birth, suffering, and then death. And then you're reborn, you suffer again, you die again, over and over and over again, forever, unless you're able to achieve enlightenment, or nirvana as it's called. However, no one really knows what nirvana actually is, what it looks like, what it feels like, where it is. Buddhists will say that the only way to actually understand nirvana is to experience it yourself. It's kind of like trying to describe to someone what chocolate tastes like. You can use any number of superlatives to describe the flavor, but until that person bites a piece of chocolate, they won't really fully understand it. And so, the goal of all Buddhists is to try to attain nirvana. And every day, hundreds of millions of Buddhists all around the world try very hard to do just that. But within Buddhism, there is a small subset of practitioners who have effectively dedicated their entire existence to attaining nirvana. And these people are the famous Buddhist monks. It is extremely difficult to become a Buddhist monk because the sacrifice is enormous. You have to leave your family, your friends, society, all your possessions, your name, your status, everything, and go live in a monastery, which is a kind of isolated place where monks live, and there you will spend your life living this very simple, very strict religious life where basically all you do is try to attain nirvana. As a result of this extreme lifestyle that Buddhist monks live, they have developed a reputation for being some of the most disciplined people on the planet. But even by Buddhist monk standards, their sacred ritual of Shokushin Butsu takes discipline to a whole nother level. Shokushin Butsu was created over 1,000 years ago up in the rugged mountains of northern Japan by a sect of Buddhists called the Shingon. And the Shingon believed that you could attain nirvana through physical punishment. And out of that idea was born the incredibly brutal Shokushin Butsu ritual. In short, Buddhist monks can choose to participate in this ritual, and if they successfully complete it, they might attain nirvana. But they won't know until the ritual is over. Meaning it's kind of like a big gamble. Put yourself through absolute hell, and maybe you have this huge payoff, but maybe not. However, trying to attain nirvana through other means was really difficult. There was no other really clear pathways to nirvana, and so having this one distinct pathway, no matter how difficult it was really appealing. And so since its creation, hundreds and hundreds of Buddhist monks have tried it, and maybe less than 100 have actually successfully completed it, and then of that 100 or less, only 24 have actually attained nirvana through this process. The instructions for Shokushin Butsu are actually quite simple. There are 3 phases. Phase 1 is called Moku Jikagayo, which roughly means tree-eating training, and it's primarily focused on the monk's diet. It takes 1,000 days to complete this phase. However, most monks go much longer than 1,000 days. During this phase, monks will only eat byproducts of trees, things like seeds, nuts, tree bark, tree roots, pine needles, and they will collect all this food on their own. It should be noted, though, that some monks in this first phase will ingest small rocks. This is likely done because they are starving and they can't find food, and by eating the rocks take up space in their stomach and kind of curb their appetite a little bit. But because they don't actually digest the rocks, they're not technically breaking the phase 1 diet restrictions, and so they can continue on with this ritual. Additionally, during this first phase, the monks adhere to a very involved and strenuous physical exercise routine, and then whenever they're not foraging for food or exercising, they are meditating. At the end of the 1000th day of phase 1, if the monk has survived, because sometimes phase 1 monks do die mostly from starvation, it is up to them if they are ready to move on to phase 2. This decision ultimately comes down to whether or not, 1, the monk actually adhered to the strict rules of phase 1, something really only that monk would know, and then 2, whether or not the monk actually believes they are spiritually ready to move on to phase 2. Phase 2 is much shorter than phase 1, but it is significantly more challenging. And so the monks going into phase 2, they really need to kind of bring their A game and have no second thoughts. They need to be fully committed to phase 2 in order to successfully complete it. For reference, most of the 24 monks who successfully attained nirvana through this ritual repeated phase 1, 2, or even 3 times just to make sure they really were ready. Phase 2 is called Nyojo, and it roughly translates to deep meditation. But a better way to think about what this phase entails is these monks need to enter into a sort of trance-like state, almost like an out-of-body experience, because what they're going to go through in this phase is so physically uncomfortable that unless you're able to kind of detach mentally, there's just no way to go through with it. And so during the second phase, the monks will sit down and meditate basically constantly for 100 straight days. And during that time, they don't eat any more tree byproducts or rocks. Instead, they have a liquid diet. They drink a little bit of salt water, and they drink a lot of a very particular kind of tea. The tea is made from Toxicodendron verniculum tree bark, which contains the same toxin in poison ivy. Meaning, for phase 2, you basically just sit alone by yourself for 100 days while simultaneously drinking a poisonous tea that causes a massive allergic reaction inside of your throat and stomach that causes an intense itching sensation inside of you that you cannot physically itch. Also, this poisonous tea gives you explosive diarrhea and it makes you vomit a lot. If you somehow manage to survive all 100 days of phase 2, and unfortunately many monks don't, you automatically move on to phase 3. Unlike phase 1, phase 2 never gets repeated, most likely because it almost certainly would be fatal to do so. Phase 3 is either the easiest or the hardest part of the Sokushinbutsu ritual, depending on how you look at it. It doesn't have a name like the other 2 phases, perhaps because so few people make it to this part of the ritual, but regardless, phase 3 definitely has a strict set of rules like the other 2 phases. The phase 3 monk has a small pine box that has no windows built just for them. It needs to be big enough that they can sit inside of it in the lotus pose, which is how they typically sit when they're meditating. And then once it's all built, the monk climbs into this box. They put a lid over the top of it, but they put a bamboo shoot, like a bamboo pole, through the cover of this box, so there is a breathing tube for this monk inside of this box. And then they lower the monk inside of the small pine box 10 feet into this hole in the ground, and then once they ensure the bamboo pole is going to be above ground so they can breathe, they fill the hole in with charcoal. Before we cover what happens next in phase 3, you need some context about what this ritual is actually doing to the monks performing it. Phase 1, tree eating training, serves 2 purposes. The first is it's kind of like a big gut check. It really shows who wants to do this ritual and who doesn't. It's kind of like if you can't complete phase 1, you certainly can't complete phase 2 or phase 3. So it's like a filter. It weeds out the weak monks. The second purpose of phase 1 is to literally shrink the monk. The tree eating diet combined with the constant physical exercise removes all of their body fat and a lot of their muscle, and so they're incredibly lean by the end of phase 1. And this will be significant when we talk about the end of phase 3. Phase 2, deep meditation phase, serves 2 purposes as well. The first purpose is that it puts the monk into that trance-like state, and then the second purpose it serves is the toxin inside of this poisonous tea kills off all of the naturally occurring bacteria and parasites inside of the monk. Again, that will become significant when we get to the end of phase 3. Speaking of which, so in phase 3, the monk is put in their box, they're lowered 10 feet into the ground, the breathing bamboo chute is installed, the charcoal is dumped on top of them, and then for several days, the third phase monk will sit in total darkness and meditate constantly, and each day, they have a bell down there with them, they ring the bell. That's the only thing they have to do besides meditate. And above ground, there is a team of monks that are supporting this ritual, and they're listening for that bell. And the first day they don't hear the bell, it means the monk in the box has completed the ritual, and now it is time to see if they have attained nirvana. In Buddhism, someone whose body does not decay, aka a mummy, is someone who has cheated death. And to cheat death is to remove yourself from the vicious human life cycle of birth, suffering, death, repeat. Meaning, becoming a mummy is a way to attain nirvana. And Sokushin Butsu is a self-mummification ritual. Phase 1 shrinks the monk's body, it removes their fat and muscle, it also removes a lot of moisture inside of their body, and their diet also withholds nutrients to all of the bacteria and parasites that naturally occur inside of their bodies. And so those bacteria and parasites that normally would play a big role in helping decompose your body after death begin to die off. And so the cumulative effect of phase 1 on these monks is that if they were to die at the end of phase 1, their decomposition would be drastically slowed. It wouldn't be mummy status, but it would be close. The phase 2 poisonous tea, that toxin that they're drinking, that kills off the remainder of the bacteria and parasites that did not die during phase 1. Also, all the vomiting and diarrhea completely dehydrates them, which aids in slowing down decomposition after death. Finally, phase 3 is the death phase. The monk goes into their tomb, they're buried underground, and they ring that bell each day to tell the people on the ground that they are still alive. And then when the bell stops ringing, it means the monk in the box is dead. At which point, the crew on the ground removes the bamboo breathing pole and then lets the body sit in the box underground for another 1,000 days. And then after 1,000 days, they pull the box up, they lift the lid off, and if there is little to no signs of decay on their body, it means the self-mummification ritual worked, they're a mummy, they've attained nirvana, and now their body is holy. And so they're brought out of the box, they're dressed in robes, they're placed in the monasteries, and they are worshipped. As for the unlucky monks who get to the end of Sokushin Butsu, but are found to be decomposing inside of their box when they're brought back up again, they're just placed back inside of their pine box and buried, and they are not worshipped. Sokushin Butsu was made illegal in Japan in the late 19th century, but we know monks continued to practice it into the 20th century, and in theory, today, monks still might practice it in secret. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button is counting something really important, start shouting out random numbers to mess them up. On the morning of August 3rd, 1915, during World War I, a 21-year-old Russian soldier named Vladimir Kotlinski looked out from behind the huge stone walls of Auschwitz Fortress in Poland. Out in front of him, he saw the same landscape he had been looking at for the last 6 months that he had been stationed at this fortress. It was a big, swampy forest that surrounded them on all sides. Additionally, in this swampy forest around them on all sides were dozens and dozens of trenches. Trenches are long, deep pits that soldiers will dig to both hide inside of when they're being attacked, and then also to launch their own attacks out of from behind their dirt walls. And these trenches that zigged and zagged all around Auschwitz Fortress were created by and now occupied by 7,000 German soldiers. And during World War I, the Russians were fighting the Germans. The Germans really wanted to take Auschwitz Fortress from the Russians. It was in a great strategic strategic position with a railway passing right through it. There was also a river nearby and a main road, meaning whoever owned this fortress was greatly aided in moving critical wartime supplies and troops in a very hotly contested area. But despite the repeated attempts by these 7,000 Germans to take over Auschwitz fortress over the past 6 months, they had all been repelled by Vladimir and the puny 900-man Russian force inside of the fortress. And so, by that morning, August 3rd, 1915, as Vladimir is looking out from the battlements over the trenches in the marsh down below, it was like both the Russians and the Germans had reached a sort of stalemate, where neither side was trying to attack the other, and neither side was leaving. They were just kind of staying put and doing nothing. In fact, over the last few weeks, there had been so little action from either side that the Russian soldiers inside the fortress got so bored, they began sneaking out the side door of the fortress to try to catch fish with their bare hands in the nearby river. But this morning, as Vladimir stood atop the wall, he noticed something strange happening in one of the trenches that was located closest to the fortress. It was still several hundred feet away, but he could see clearly down into this trench. And what he saw was there was this cluster of high-ranking German officers that were kind of huddled together, and they kept looking down at the ground at something inside of the trench that Vladimir couldn't see, and then they would look up at the sky and kind of wave their hands around, and then they'd look back down at the ground below them. Now, Vladimir had no idea what they were doing. I mean, again, he could not see what they were looking at in the trench, and when he looked up into the sky where they seemed to be looking, it just looked like a regular blue sky. But whatever they were doing, it was making Vladimir feel nervous. Vladimir was a young junior officer, which meant he was in charge of other soldiers, but because he was so new, he lacked experience and credibility, and so really wasn't considered a serious leader within the army. And so Vladimir, as he's watching this strange behavior, was concerned that if he left now and told his superiors that he was worried about the Germans because they were looking at the sky funny and looking at the ground funny, that it would make him look like he was being paranoid and not a good leader. And so ultimately, Vladimir just looked at this cluster inside of the trench and decided, you know what, they're not shooting at us, there's no attack happening, so whatever they're doing, it can't be that big of a deal. And lately, no one's done anything, so why would that change now? And so Vladimir left the walls of Auschwitz Fortress and went down below to hang out with his friends. 3 days later, at 4 in the morning, the Russian soldiers who were up along the Auschwitz fortress walls keeping watch that night noticed something strange out in the darkness near where the Germans were. When they looked out, they saw that the dark night air almost looked kind of blurry or wavy, kind of like if you were looking at air coming off of hot pavement on a sunny day, it would look kind of blurry. That's what the night sky looked like to them. But of course, it couldn't be because of heat and sun, because it's the morning, it's cold, it's dark outside. And so as these Russians are looking out, not sure what to make of this blurry air, they began calling up more Russians to go have a look and figure out what this was. And over the next couple of minutes, as the Russians looked out from behind the walls at this air, they realized what it was. It was this huge grayish-green cloud that was as wide as the fortress was, and the wind was blowing it in their direction. Now, the Russian soldiers had no idea what this was, and so they just kind of stood there watching it in stunned silence. And as they watched, they saw as the cloud would touch any vegetation like leaves on trees or the high grass in the marsh, it would all turn black and shrivel up. And then the soldiers began hearing a soft thump, 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 thump out in the darkness. And it was the sound of birds dying and falling to the ground that were inside of this cloud. At this point, the Russians began to panic, and they began to run to sound the alarm to get the other soldiers up to prepare for an attack. But as they did, they began to smell this very harsh chemical smell coming into the fortress, and then before long, all the Russians could hear was the sound of their comrades coughing. It would turn out that strange behavior that Vladimir saw 3 days earlier of the German officers huddled together looking at the sky and then looking down at the ground and then back at the sky again, what they were doing was preparing for a chemical attack on Auschwitz Fortress. On the ground, out of sight of Vladimir, were canisters containing the poisonous gas, and when the officers would look up and put their hands up, they were gauging if the wind was strong enough and in the right direction to launch the attack. Now, 3 days ago, the wind had not been in their favor, but this morning at 4 a.m. on August 6th, 1915, the wind had been in their favor, and they had released the gas. And this gas was quite possibly the worst gas you could ever come up against on the battlefield. It was a combination of chlorine gas and bromine gas. On their own, chlorine and bromine are very toxic and can kill you. But when you mix those two gases, it becomes exponentially more dangerous. The gas mixture binds to moisture and then turns the moisture into hydrochloric acid. Meaning, if a person who did not have a gas mask on came in contact with this poisonous gas, when they inhaled it, it would literally fill their lungs with acid, which would dissolve them from the inside out. And then also, the gas would get into their eyes and into their nose, and the acid there would burrow holes into their skull. And once you've come in contact with this gas, there's nothing anybody can do to save you. You're gonna die, except it's gonna take a really, really long time. You don't just immediately dissolve. It's this long, drawn-out, excruciatingly painful process. By this point in World War I, chemical warfare was really not being used by anybody, and so as a result, the Russian army did not outfit their soldiers with gas masks. The German army did, and they knew the Russian army did not. So, as this horrific poisonous gas began permeating every square inch of Auschwitz Fortress, all of these Russian soldiers had nothing they could do to protect themselves from this gas. And so right away, soldiers began bleeding from their eyes and their mouths and their ears, and they literally began coughing up chunks of their lung. And so very quickly, the Russians inside the fortress understood they were being poisoned. And so these soldiers that were not as affected, at least not right away, by this gas, quickly began ripping off their shirts, dunking them in water, and wrapping them around their heads to try to limit how much they breathed in of this chemical. But it really didn't do much to stop the chemical. In fact, these makeshift gas masks might have made it worse because the gas would have bound to the moisture on the shirt. And so the Russians were totally doomed. They were surrounded on all sides outside the walls by their enemy, and then inside the fortress was this gas, and there was no ventilation in the fortress, and so there was nowhere to go. They couldn't escape death no matter where they went. And so Vladimir, he was one of the guys that was still on his feet inside of the fortress, and he stumbled over to this narrow window on the side of the fortress walls, and he looked out and he saw all these Germans running towards them, firing their machine guns, artillery's being fired. I mean, he knows they are moments away from the Germans breaching the fortress door, coming inside, and killing every last one of them. But Vladimir's reaction to this was not being scared or being sad. Instead, he suddenly felt incredibly motivated. If they're going to come in here and kill us, then we're going to make it as hard as humanly possible first. Vladimir had a reputation for being totally fearless. Over the past 6 months that they had been under siege from the German army out in their trenches, anytime fighting broke out, Vladimir was always the first to run up and be right on the front line of fighting, and then several times when his comrades had been shot or wounded, Vladimir would run out into the line of fire to save the fallen soldiers. It was like Vladimir lacked any instinct for self-preservation. And so as the Germans continued their run towards the fortress, artillery shells are hitting the walls, there's constant gunfire, and Vladimir, he leaves his window and he marches back over to the open courtyard inside of this fortress where the 100 or so other still living Russian soldiers were. I mean, they're all gonna die. They've been totally poisoned by this gas, and it's just a matter of time now, but they're still on their feet, and Vladimir walks over to them, and even though, again, he's pretty junior, he stands up and he says to them, "This is our moment. We are all going to die, but what we do right now will define us." And the way Vladimir said it, he got those 100 soldiers who were on death's door to be so motivated so quickly that they rallied to him. And so as these men are literally bleeding out of their eyes, their mouths, they're coughing up pieces of their lung, Vladimir explained the plan. And then moments later, with Vladimir in the front, this gaggle of soon-to-die Russian soldiers charged towards the gates, opened the fortress, and began running out towards the Germans, screaming with their bayonets lowered. Now, the Germans on the outside fully expected that this chemical attack would kill all of the Russians, that taking Auschwitz Fortress would be super routine because when they walked in, everybody would be dead. And so suddenly to have the fortress open and have these men that are covered in bloody rags and they're puking up pieces of their organs and they're stumbling forward like zombies with bayonets out, screaming like banshees, it scared the living out of the Germans. In fact, they were so quickly terrified by what they saw, they literally dropped their guns, turned, and began running back towards their trenches. And as they did, Vladimir and his dead man army began picking off the Germans one by one. And then after Vladimir and the dead man army ran out of ammunition, they just continued staggering forward directly into the thousands of Germans in front of them and began picking up dead German weapons and firing them. And then when they got up to the trenches where these retreating Germans had been so scared they had run into their own barbed wire, and so there's all these retreating Germans stuck on the barbed wire, the Russians just began bayoneting all these men that were stuck. And so at some point, as Vladimir is doing this, a German soldier ran up to him and bayoneted Vladimir right in the stomach. He ran him all the way through until the barrel of the gun was right up against his stomach. And Vladimir apparently looked down at this bayonet, knew he had been completely run through, and he looked up at the German who had just stabbed him, who was still holding the gun, and Vladimir spit blood and lung tissue all over this German's face, and then just began screaming directly at this guy. And so the German was so scared, he just dropped the gun, turned, tried to run, and then Vladimir was back on his gun with the bayonet still in his stomach, shooting at the Germans. The Germans were so completely caught off guard and terrified by Vladimir's dead man army counterattack that even though they outnumbered the Russians 70-1, they failed to take Auschwitz Fortress. The main reason for that was the Germans who had escaped the counterattack and made it back to their trenches. They told the other German soldiers that the Russians had turned into zombies, literally, that they were undead, and so attacking them was pointless. They're already dead. And the Germans were so scared, they refused to leave their trenches again. Once the Russians could tell they had successfully forced a retreat by the German army, Vladimir, who was still alive at this point with a gun still stuck in his gut from the bayonet, he called out to the rest of his soldiers to retreat back to the fortress. And so this handful of Russian soldiers who were about to die, they hobbled their way back inside of their fortress, and then Vladimir gave his final command: destroy the fortress. If we can't have it, nobody can. Every single Russian soldier that came in contact with that poisonous gas died, including Vladimir. When the Germans did eventually take Auschwitz Fortress at a later date, when again, all of the Russians were dead, when the Germans went inside, they realized the fortress had been destroyed and it was no longer strategically valuable. Vladimir would be awarded posthumously Russia's highest military honor. His actions and the actions of the other dying soldiers that fought alongside him are remembered today in stories, songs, and statues all across Russia. On a cold day in January of 2017, a 26-year-old man named William Hargrove paced anxiously back and forth inside of his tiny bedroom. Will was nervous because he was about to take the biggest chance of his life. He was about to ask a woman, who he had only known for a few weeks, if she would marry him. Will looked around his bedroom and he saw there was dirty clothes coming out of his hamper and there was fast food trash all over the ground. And so he knew this was not the ideal location to ask someone to marry him, but he also knew he was running out of time. The woman he wanted to propose to, who was sitting right behind him on his bed, was about to head back to Russia where she lived in just a few hours. And so Will finally stopped pacing, he turned to face this woman on the bed, who was just sitting there silently, and Will was about to say something, but then he chickened out and just kept on pacing. To that point, Will's life had been pretty boring and lonely. He worked a low-paying job as a mechanic, and he lived in this bedroom. This was his apartment, this one room, which was being rented to him by a married couple who owned the house it was in. And this house was in a small city in the US state of Oregon. Will didn't really have any friends, and he didn't really have any meaningful hobbies. All he really had was his intense love of science fiction and fantasy. He would lose himself for hours watching movies about outer space and strange, distant alien planets and magic, and then often after he would watch these movies, he would walk into the forest near his house and he would just kind of wander around daydreaming about these movies, and he would pretend he was the hero from these movies. And suddenly in his mind, Will would become a sorcerer with great powers or a brilliant scientist who went back in time to save the world. But as much as Will loved daydreaming and fantasizing, what he really wanted was a wife and kids. And so recently, he had joined an international dating website, and it was through that website that he connected with 26-year-old Anna Repkina from Russia, who was the woman sitting on the bed behind him. And now, if Will could just muster the courage to pop the question to her, he was confident she would say yes, and he could finally start his real life with Anna. Anna, who had blonde hair and striking blue eyes, was a bit of a dreamer like Will. For example, she fundamentally believed that there was a soulmate somewhere in the world for everyone. However, to that point in her life, she had not found her soulmate. Instead, she had been through one bad breakup after another. But a few weeks earlier, when a short, stocky, bald guy with a bushy goatee, Will, had reached out to her on an international dating website and invited her to America to visit him, she believed it was fate that they were being brought together, and so Will had to be her soulmate. Will finally stopped pacing and turned again to face Anna, who was now reading a book on the edge of the bed. And Will, who was terrified at this point, took a deep breath and then reached into his pocket and pulled out a jewelry box. Inside of it was a beautiful emerald ring that was situated on a white gold band. And so Will took a step towards Anna, he dropped down to a knee, and he held out the jewelry box and he opened it up. At first, Anna didn't know what Will was doing and was kind of confused, but when she saw the ring and saw him on his knee, she knew what was happening, and she began trembling with excitement. And then Will, he pulled the ring out of its holder and he slipped it onto Anna's finger, and he asked her if she would marry him. And Anna, she began crying tears of joy and shouted, yes. Later that day, Anna would fly back home to Russia, but as soon as she landed, she began getting her affairs in order to go right back to Oregon to live with Will permanently. And 2 months later, in March of 2017, Anna was touching back down at the Oregon airport, and then right near the baggage claim, she had her big reunion with Will. That evening, when Anna and Will drove from the airport to Will's place, they parked the car, they got out, they grabbed Anna's luggage, they went up the front steps, and when Will unlocked the front door to go inside of the house to make their way up to his bedroom apartment, as soon as the door swung open, there was a woman standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, staring out at both of them. This woman was 34-year-old Michelle Chavez, and she and her husband were the married couple who rented the bedroom apartment to Will. Michelle had dark hair and piercing eyes, and even when she was being pleasant, she could be very intimidating. And right now, it was obvious she was not trying to be pleasant. And so Anna, who sensed something was wrong here, kind of awkwardly said hi to Michelle, but Michelle, she just glared at Anna and said nothing, and then looked from Anna to Will and said, Will, I need to talk to you. And then before Will could say anything, Michelle grabbed his arm and began dragging him through the house to the back. And as Will is kind of stumbling along after Michelle, he tried to be calm and told Anna, just go ahead and take your stuff up to the room. I'll be up there in a minute. And so Anna, she's very confused about what's happening here. She does not understand this dynamic at all, but she began taking her suitcases and marching over to the side of the house where Will's bedroom was. And as she did this, she could hear on the other side of the house, Michelle really yelling at Will, but Anna couldn't make out what Michelle was actually saying. And so at some point, when Anna was now inside of Will's bedroom, just kind of waiting, Will finally did come into the bedroom with his head hung down low, and Anna could just tell that, obviously he's just been yelled at, he looks defeated, and so Anna's trying to make eye contact with him, and finally, Will looks up at Anna, and Anna says, hey, what's going on? Why was she so upset? What's happening here? And in a quiet, trembling voice, Will would tell Anna that Michelle and her husband had just told him that they can't live here anymore. They have to move out. Anna couldn't believe this. She had just flown across the world to be here with Will, and now they don't have a place to live. But she could tell, obviously, Will is really upset about this too. And so instead of just being mad at him, she said, what's going on? Why is she kicking us out? And at first, Will kind of acted like he didn't really know. But then eventually, when Anna kept asking for more information, he would tell her that Michelle sort of had a crush on him. And when she saw Anna moving in with Will, she became really jealous and told them to leave. When Anna brought up the fact that Michelle was married, Will said, I know, she's married, the crush hasn't gone anywhere, but she still feels really jealous. Anna was obviously really upset about this situation, but after Will had explained what's going on with Michelle, Anna wasn't mad at Michelle, she actually felt kind of bad for her. It was sort of pathetic that this married woman was acting the way she was. And so Anna actually figured that really this is probably for the best, that we should get away from Michelle. And within a few days, Anna and Will had moved out of Michelle's place and found a place of their own in a neighboring town. And as soon as they were settled inside of there, it was like relief washed over both of them. And they both became really excited to plan their wedding and think about their future together. A few weeks later, on March 25th, 2017, Anna woke up early and put on her beautiful, simple white wedding dress that she brought from Russia, and then she and Will piled into his car and they headed to the beach. The couple had decided to go with a very simple, intimate outdoor wedding ceremony led by an officiant. An officiant is someone who can legally conduct a wedding. When the couple arrived at the beach, Anna hopped out and immediately began walking over the sand towards the water, and Will stayed back to call the officiant because he didn't see him anywhere. And so when Anna reached the water, she took in the beautiful sights and sounds of the beach. She felt the sun on her face and she listened to the sound of the waves crashing. And it was like suddenly she realized how lucky she was. I mean, this wedding day was turning out to be perfect when over the past couple of weeks, she wasn't sure if it was even going to happen. Even though Anna and Will had left Michelle's house and had no contact with her, over the past couple of weeks, Michelle had become a sort of thorn in their side, sending Anna all these really threatening messages, things like demanding that Anna share Will with her, or else she'll do something awful. And so Anna is thinking that Michelle is going to find a way to sabotage their wedding, but here they were on the beach about to get married with no Michelle in sight. And so at some point, Anna looked along the beach and saw a little bit farther along were the two friends that she and Will had invited to be a part of their wedding. And so Anna ran over to them and she hugged them and began chatting with them. And as she's chatting, she looks up and she sees Will coming down onto the beach and he's on his cell phone. And Anna can't tell what he's saying. He's too far away, but it's obvious there's something wrong. And by the time Will actually got up to the group, he had hung up his phone, but it was very obvious he was really upset. And as soon as he reached the group, he would announce to Anna and their friends that the officiant was not going to be able to make it. And so unfortunately, the wedding was off, at least for now. Now, Anna was totally crushed by this, but she could tell Will also was totally crushed by this. And so instead of crying and making Will feel worse, Anna put on a brave face and told Will, don't worry about it. We will find another officiant. We'll reschedule this. It will be fine. And so Anna and Will's friends, they said bye and they headed their way. And Anna and Will had a very somber walk along the beach back to their car. But on the drive from the beach back to their apartment, they would stop at a fast food restaurant, McDonald's, and they would get some food. And by the time they had made it back to their apartment, they were laughing about how ridiculous it was that they were eating fast food in their wedding clothes. A couple weeks later, Anna was still in the process of rescheduling their wedding, and she was starting to feel very frustrated with Will. Over the last week or so, Will, instead of helping her with the wedding, was spending much of his time outside of the apartment, pacing around, chain smoking, while talking to someone on the phone. Now, Anna didn't know who he was talking to, but based on how stressed out he seemed, Anna assumed he had to be talking to either Michelle or talking to someone else about Michelle. Regardless, Anna knew this had to, in some way, be connected to Michelle. However, whenever Anna would approach Will and ask him why he was so stressed and whether or not he was still in contact with Michelle, Will would try to change the subject, or he would just clam up and not talk at all. But finally, on April 16th, so 3 weeks after the couple's first failed wedding attempt, Will would approach Anna and ask her very sheepishly if she would come with him on a walk through the woods, because he had something important he wanted to tell her. Now, Anna knew that Will loved walking in these woods. He still went off and daydreamed after his movies, and so she knew that if he's asking her to go out there to talk, that this was going to be a very serious conversation, most likely about Michelle and whatever's going on. And so the couple piled into Will's car and they drove to the parking lot right near the woods. They got out, they hopped on a path, and they began walking into the trees. And for a while, they didn't really talk to each other. They just walked quietly side by side through the woods. But at some point, Will began to slow down and then finally came to a full stop, at which point Anna stopped too, and she turned to face him. And when she did, Will paused for a moment and then with a shaky voice told Anna that he felt like they rushed into their relationship and he wanted to call off the engagement. Anna was so caught off guard and heartbroken by what she was hearing that she couldn't say anything. She just stood there in stunned silence and then finally just turned around and stormed off away from Will deeper into the woods until she was out of Will's sight. The next day, when Will woke up, the first thing he did was pick up his phone and text Anna. But Anna didn't write back. And so as Will is laying in bed, he couldn't help but feel this overwhelming sense of regret about the decision he had made the day before. He wanted Anna back. So over the course of the next several hours, Will would send Anna a series of increasingly more desperate sounding text messages, pleading with her to just talk to him, please. But she didn't respond to any of his messages. And so Will decided that the only way he could get Anna back would be if he did something big. So he hopped out of his bed, he grabbed his cigarettes, he went outside, and he began pacing and chain smoking, trying to come up with whatever big idea was going to get Anna back. And at some point, an idea came to him. He would do what he had seen heroes do in several of his favorite science fiction and fantasy movies. He would use time travel to go back in time and get Anna back. Feeling totally energized by this idea, Will ran back inside his apartment, he grabbed another pack of cigarettes, a 6-pack of soda, and then he sat down at his computer and he scoured the internet for any information about how to build a time-traveling machine. And for the next 24 to 48 hours, Will stayed at his computer, chain smoking and drinking sodas, drawing all these sketches of different time machine designs that he found on the internet. But at some point, after 24 to 48 hours, Will realized that no matter how good these sketches were, he lacked 1, the resources, and 2, the knowledge and expertise of how to take this sketch and actually make it into a real physical time machine. And so feeling totally frustrated, Will took a sketchbook and threw it, and then lay down on his bed, feeling somewhat defeated. But as he laid there thinking about Anna, he had another epiphany. In other science fiction and fantasy movies, sometimes the heroes didn't need to use time machines to go back in time, they would use magic. And so suddenly Will decided, oh my goodness, I need to find the right magical spell that will allow me to travel back in time and get Anna. And so once again, he ran back to his computer, continued chain smoking and drinking sodas while scouring the internet, looking for the right magical spell that would take him back in time. And several times he communicated with strangers on the internet, telling them that he would sell his soul to them if they could give him the right spell. And then anytime he thought he found the right spell, he would close his eyes and chant the words out loud, and then open his eyes only to realize he was stuck in the present. And so finally, after basically staying awake for 72 hours on this quest to go back in time to get Anna back, Will realized that it was not going to work, and so he gave up. The next morning, on April 19th, so this is 3 days after he broke up with Anna in the woods, Will heard a knock on his front door. And when he opened the door, there were 2 police officers standing there. And when Will asked them, what's going on, they told him that they actually needed his help, and would he mind coming to the station to talk to them. And so Will, he was still totally exhausted from not having slept over the last 3 days, but he of course agreed to go. And when he got to the police station, he was led into a small interview room, and he sat down behind this metal desk in front of the other two officers, and he asked them, what can I do for you? And one of the officers eventually asked Will if he had recently eaten at a Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant. That's a fast food restaurant also known as KFC. Will was puzzled and almost wanted to laugh because he couldn't understand how this was important. But when he saw that these two officers were not making light of this at all, they were very serious, Will said, "Yeah, a few days ago I did eat at a KFC. Why does that matter?" To understand why it mattered, we need to understand the relationship between Will and Michelle. It would turn out Michelle did not just have a crush on Will. Michelle and Will had been having an intense affair right in Michelle's house with her husband since 2015, so a full year before Will met Anna. Now, Will had wanted Michelle to leave her husband and be with him, and Michelle had told Will that she wanted the same thing, but she couldn't do it right now. And so to show Will that she was serious, that one day she would be with him, she gave him her wedding ring, which was an emerald stone sitting on a white gold band. It was like a promise ring, that this is my token to you to show you that one day we will be together in public. But as time went on, Michelle didn't really show any signs of trying to leave her husband, and so Will started to wonder if he was just kind of letting his life slip by. Because remember, Will really wanted a wife and kids, and it was starting to look like Michelle was not going to give him either of those things. And so that was why Will went on that dating site and contacted Anna, and then when he learned that Anna wanted a family too, he had asked her to marry him. The ring that Will gave Anna when he proposed to her was the same ring that Michelle had given Will. Her wedding ring, the promise ring. And so when Michelle saw that ring on Anna's finger on a Facebook post that Anna made about having been proposed to by Will, Michelle was enraged. And then just a few weeks later, when Anna showed up at Michelle's house to move into Will's bedroom with him, she grabbed Will, dragged him to the side of the house, and said, "You need to choose right now between me and Anna." And because Will couldn't come up with an answer, Michelle kicked him and Anna out of the house. However, over the following weeks, despite Michelle having booted them from her property, she could not let go of her jealousy of Anna and her love for Will. And so she sent Anna all these threatening messages on Facebook demanding that she share Will with her or else, and she began incessantly calling and texting Will demanding that he choose her over Anna. And so when Anna saw Will walking around outside chain-smoking cigarettes on the phone, Anna was right in suspecting that that was Michelle that he was talking to. But despite all this pressure, Will just could not make up his mind. He didn't know which woman he wanted to be with more. And so to buy himself some time, he had lied to Anna about hiring an officiant for their wedding on the beach. And then when they arrived on the beach and Will said the officiant had canceled, it was all a ruse. There was never any officiant. He was just trying to buy time for himself. But finally, on April 16th, for whatever reason, Will had decided that he knew which woman he wanted to go with. He wanted to go with Michelle. So he brought Anna out into the woods and he told her the news, that he was breaking off the engagement and effectively their relationship was over, at which point Anna turned and stormed off into the woods. And so Will, he watched her disappear, and then he turned around and walked back along the path back toward his car. And when he got there, he opened his trunk and got something out of it, and then he walked back along the trail into the woods where he had seen Anna last. And when he reached that spot, he kind of walked off in the direction that Anna had wandered, and eventually he spotted Anna. She was standing in a clearing, looking up into the sky, seemingly lost in thought. And so Will quietly walked up right behind her, and then he raised the shotgun he had gotten out of his trunk. He placed the barrel against the back of Anna's skull, and before she could even react, say something, turn around, do anything, he pulled the trigger. Afterward, he ran back down the trail to his car, and he gathered up all of Anna's things that happened to be inside of the car, along with some trash on the floor of the car, and then he brought all of that stuff back into the woods and kind of dumped it both on and around Anna's body. The next day, a walker and their dog happened to come across Anna's body, and when the police were called out to the site, they began sifting through all of the trash that was kind of scattered around Anna's body. And inside of a crumpled up KFC bag, the police would find a receipt for the day of the murder. And that receipt belonged to Will. The morning after Will killed Anna, he sent those initial text messages to Anna just to cover his tracks. But as he sent them, he actually did feel an enormous sense of regret about the decision he made. He no longer wanted Michelle, he wanted Anna. And it was at that point that he decided he would do what the heroes in some of his favorite movies did. He would go back in time and undo the murder and get his love back. But of course, his efforts would fail. And in January of 2020, 3 years after Anna's murder, Will was sentenced to life in prison. As for Michelle, she was never charged with any crime. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please move all of the strike plates in the like button's door frames slightly lower so that when they try to close their door, it doesn't latch. On March 4th, 1946, nearly every resident of a rural Brazilian town called Araçariguama packed up a few days' worth of food and drink and headed south to the nearest big city to celebrate the Festival of Carnaval. This festival is an opportunity for folks to cut loose and eat good food right before most of them go into a religious fasting period. One resident who opted not to join the fun at this festival was a 44-year-old man named João Prestige Filho. João was a farmer, he had 5 kids, he was a very quiet guy, and he did not enjoy things like the Festival for Carnaval. The crowds and the noise made him anxious, and he really hated dancing, which there was a lot of at these festivals. Instead, João would rather spend his spare time out in nature. And so, when João's friends and family and everybody else disappeared to head off to this festival, João did just that. He and his best friend packed up João's horse and cart, and they traveled across the dirt roads through the woods to the nearby Tietê River, where they spent the day fishing for catfish. And as João stood on the rocks casting out his line, he listened to the birds sing and the parrots swooping by. It was beautiful and sunny out. I mean, this was a perfect day for João. As sunset drew near, though, both João and his best friend knew that while the rainforest they were in was beautiful during the day, at night it could become quite hazardous with the animals that come out at night, and so they knew they needed to leave. And so they packed up all the fish they caught back into João's cart, and then the two of them hopped onto the cart and began making the journey back towards the town of Araçariguama. When the pair got to a split in the road, João's best friend hopped off the cart and walked on foot down one path because his house was actually just outside of the town, and João, still in his cart with his horse, said bye to his friend and went the other direction. Now, by this point, the sun had completely set, and so it was totally dark out as João is going down this dirt road in the final stretch towards his town. At this time, in 1946, Araçariguama was a beautiful place, but by no means a modern place. They had no running water, no electricity, there was no sewage, no paved roads, no access to main roads, and nobody had a telephone. It was basically like this little patch of civilization with about 100 people living there. There was a church in the middle of the town and a couple of small huts that kind of sat around it. And João and his family lived in one of those huts. João usually loved walking along or traveling along this particular stretch of dirt road, especially at night, like he was doing right now. He really enjoyed looking up at the stars and listening to the animals off in the forest that he couldn't see. But this night, João just had a bad feeling as he was making this final approach towards his town. Now remember, there's almost no one in the town. They're all at this festival, so it's kind of like a ghost town in the middle of a forest. But João, as he's going down this dirt road and he can see the church up ahead, he's a couple 100 feet away, he began getting this very unnerving sense that he was being watched. And so João, as he's in his cart, began looking into the trees and all around him, wondering if maybe an animal or a person was nearby, but there was no one. Finally, Joao actually reached the church, and he could see his little house, and he could also see that his wife, who was at the festival, had opened up one of the windows just slightly so he could open it up the rest of the way and crawl into the house when he was back from fishing, because she had locked the doors when she left. And so by this point, Joao was trying to be very calm and collected despite this stress of feeling like he's being watched. But when he saw that window and he saw how close he was to his house, he basically just had the horse sprint the rest of the way to his home. He just wanted to get off the streets. And so finally, Joao, he reaches his house, he crawls in through the window, he shuts it behind him, and immediately Joao expected to feel totally relieved that he was now behind locked and closed doors and windows. He was safe. But despite being inside of his home, he still had this sense that there was someone or something around him that was watching him. Joao, like many other residents of this village, was fairly superstitious. There was an old abandoned mine that was near the town, and Joao and his peers had grown up hearing stories about some monster that lived in the mine that would come out at night and roam the forest. And older people in this village would talk about this ancient serpent called Boitata that would come out at night, and it would appear in a burst of fire. And so Joao, he's thinking about the mine and these demons and ghosts that roam in the forest, and he's all alone because everyone's at this festival and he doesn't feel safe inside of his house, and so he's really starting to panic. And it's at this moment that he suddenly feels this sense that whatever or whoever has been watching him is right out his window to his left. And so Joao, as he's turning to look out the window, he's anticipating seeing a person out there, or maybe a jaguar or some other animal that's followed him from the rainforest. But when Joao turns and looks out the window into the dark night, what he sees right outside of his property was so terrifying that for a second Joao couldn't even breathe. And he just stood there staring at this thing, and then he tried to put his hands up to protect himself, but it was already too late. Minutes later, Joao would come stumbling out of his front door, out into the dark night. He's got a big blanket wrapped around him, and he was just screaming incoherently. And as he screamed all this nonsense, he began running in this kind of zigzag pattern with no clear destination in mind. It was just like this mindless running all through the village. And as he's running, he's got no shoes on, and he's stepping on sharp rocks and glass and trash. He's cutting his feet up horribly, but he doesn't seem to even notice. And so as he's doing this, he's causing this huge scene, but everybody's gone. It's a ghost town. It's just him in this abandoned village in the middle of a rainforest in Brazil. But eventually, Joao kind of calmed himself down and ran to his sister's house, Marie, because he noticed there was a lamp on inside of her house, and he was hoping that maybe she too had stayed back from the festival. And it would turn out Marie had not gone to the festival. She too did not really like big gatherings like that, and so she was home. And so Marie was in her kitchen when she began hearing outside this horrible screaming sound, almost guttural sounds coming from someone or some animal out there. And then before she could even figure out what it was, she heard this loud thud against her door. Marie was terrified, and she ran to her front window to look out and see what it was that had just collided with her door. And what she saw made no sense. It was her brother, Joao, but he was wrapped in that big blanket and his feet were all bloody, and he was screaming at the top of his lungs, but he wasn't saying anything. He was just kind of babbling. And so Marie was about to run over and open the door for her brother. But right before she did, as she's looking out the window, Joao turned and looked at her, and when he did, she screamed because his eyes looked so alien. They were wide and totally unfocused, and she thought, that can't be my brother. What's wrong with him? But she would go over and open the door because after all, it is her brother. And so she opens the door, Joao kind of falls into the room and began writhing around on the ground, continuing this scream he was emitting that didn't even seem human. And the whole time, Marie is trying to ask him, what's wrong? What's going on here? She's scanning him, and besides the cuts all over his feet, he didn't appear to have other injuries. And so eventually, Marie just knelt down and she was about to grab Joao and try to kind of stop him
him from moving around, to just look at him and try to have a conversation with him. But before she grabbed him, Joao rolled over and his lips opened up, exposing his teeth, and he kind of grimaced at her with those wild, unfocused eyes. And again, Marie just kind of backed up in horror. Who is this? What's happened to my brother? And as Marie stood up to get away from Joao, still with that sickening grin with his teeth exposed, had this kind of low hiss come out of his mouth. And so Marie, thinking he was trying to talk, she leaned in, and through this hiss, she heard him repeating, "It burns, it burns." And so Marie, thinking her brother must have been burned, instinctively began removing the blanket and pulling his clothes off to find the source of this burn on her brother. But besides the cuts all over his feet, as she's looking at his body, his skin looked totally normal. He looked completely unhurt. And so Marie turned up to look at Joao's face again to ask him more questions in hopes maybe he could tell her something. And it was at that moment she noticed that even though he didn't seem to have any other injuries, his complexion on his face was now starting to change. Now, Joao's cheeks had turned this kind of dark purple and almost looked like they were starting to swell. And so at this point, Marie knew, okay, I can't handle this. I don't know what's going on here. And so she would stand up and just kind of back away from Joao, who's still got that grimace with his teeth exposed and his purple cheeks. He's staring up at Marie. And Marie, she finally backs out and she goes out the front door and she begins running to the other side of town. Marie knew that there were two other men who had stayed home from this festival. It was the town sheriff and the town doctor, whose name was Arasi Gumiji. And those two men lived close together on the other side of town. And when Marie arrived in front of their homes and began pounding on their doors and yelling for help, the two men quickly came outside, at which point Marie tried to explain what was happening to her brother, but she didn't really have the words, and so she just said, "He needs your help." And so the two men just went with Marie and they ran back across town to Marie's house, where Joao was still on the ground, writhing in pain when they went inside. Marie had only been gone for a couple of minutes, but by now it wasn't just Joao's cheeks that had turned that purplish color. His chest and arms were also turning purple. At this point, the sheriff leaned over Joao and began asking him some questions, and Joao, he was obviously in horrible pain from something, but by this point he had calmed down enough to where he was speaking a little bit more. But what he was saying made no sense. He told the sheriff that he had been followed home and then he got burned. And when the sheriff asked him, "Who burned you?" all Joao could say was, "No one is to blame." At this point, the sheriff left Marie's house and jogged over to Joao's house to look for some sign of how he got burned. But when he got there, the house was completely unburned. Everything was exactly as it should have been. There was no scorch marks. There was not even a lit candle anywhere. So there was no clues as to what happened to Joao. By the time the sheriff got back to Marie's, it had been about 45 minutes from when Joao first got hurt. And now, whatever was happening to his body that was turning him purple appeared to be getting much worse. Joao's skin all over his face and his chest and his arms was now not only a very dark purple, but his skin was starting to blister and pop. In fact, there was one area on his arm that had bubbled up so much that when it burst, you could actually see the bone in his arm. It was almost like Joao had been boiled in water, like the way you would boil meat on a bone until the meat was tender enough that it fell off the bone. It was like that was happening to Joao. And so as Joao's flesh just sort of began cooking off of him, the town doctor, Arasi, said, "We have to get him to a hospital right now." But because the roads were not paved and it was dangerous traveling at night, they knew they couldn't get him to the big city hospital. They would have to take him to a local hospital. And so the sheriff, who had a truck, said, "Let's just put him in the truck and I will drive him there." And so Arasi, the sheriff, and Marie, they got a new sheet, they wrapped up Joao inside of it, and they brought him outside, they put him in the sheriff's truck, and they began driving towards the hospital. Arasi stayed in the back with Joao as they made this drive, and every time the truck went over a bump, Joao would let out a cry of pain, and Arasi would look over and he would literally see these bumps were causing his skin to kind of fall off of his body. When they finally arrived at the local hospital, the staff there pulled Joao inside, they put him in a private room, they put him on a bed, and they had no idea how to treat him. It was like his injuries looked nothing like they had ever seen. They didn't even know where to begin, and they kind of assumed that Joao would not survive whatever was happening to him. And so the first thing they did is just pumped him full of painkillers. And while these painkillers didn't actually do anything to stop basically Joao's body from decomposing while he was still alive, they did at least allow Joao to stop feeling this horrible pain of his flesh falling off of him. And so Joao finally just kind of sunk back in his bed, and the sight of him must have just been horrific. He literally had huge chunks of his flesh just missing. I mean, literally parts of his skeleton were exposed to the naked eye. After the doctors had gotten Joao as stable as they could get him, Arasi, the local town doctor, sat down next to Joao and just began asking him questions. And for the first time, Joao was able to talk somewhat normally because he was on such a high dose of painkillers. And so Arasi began asking Joao to go over everything that happened from the time he left fishing for catfish until he arrived at his house and got burned. This is roughly what Joao told Arasi. He said on his walk home from fishing, he started getting that feeling that he was being watched, and it got more and more intense as he got into town, until finally he basically sprinted the rest of the way to his house, practically dove through that open window, shut it behind him, and expected to feel relief being in his own home again. But he didn't. The feeling only intensified that he was being watched. And at some point, he got that sense that whoever or whatever was watching him was to his left, out the window, out into his yard. And when Joao turned to look, what he saw standing outside was this dark figure kind of hovering over the ground, and it was staring right at Joao. And before Joao could even put his hands up to protect himself from whatever or whoever this was, this figure shot this bright ray of light directly into Joao's home through that window, which hit Joao in the chest and the face. And immediately Joao was blinded and confused by this light, and then it really started to burn. He believed he was on fire, which is why he grabbed that blanket and wrapped it around himself. He was trying to put out a non-existent fire, and that's when he stumbled outside and kind of zigged and zagged, kind of half trying to put this fire out until he arrived at Marie's house. But when he got there, that sensation of feeling like he was on fire didn't go away. It just got worse and worse and worse, and then his skin began falling off. When Arasi asked Joao, who do you think did this to you? Who do you think that figure was? And Joao, with bulging eyes, would sit forward and say to Arasi, "It wasn't of this world." And as Joao said this, a chunk from his cheek fell off, exposing his jaw and teeth. And as this happened, Joao asked one of the nurses for a water. And so Arasi is sitting there having heard this story as Joao, who's all hopped up on painkillers, is grabbing this water and drinking, and Arasi is watching the water dribble out of the hole now on the side of Joao's face. About 4 hours later, Joao would pass away from his injuries. There has never been any official explanation for what actually happened to Joao. The doctors just wrote cardiac arrest and generalized burns on his death certificate because they really had no idea what else to call this. Joao's family believed the Boitata, the ancient serpent that lived in the forest and appeared at night in a ball of fire, was responsible for what happened to Joao. Other people in town thought maybe it was the monsters or demons from the old abandoned mine that had come out and attacked Joao. Outside of Joao's town, people have theorized that Joao must have been subjected to some really high dose of radiation, and so this theory has led people to believe that, perhaps Joao was the victim of a secret weapon that the government was testing. But to create such a concentrated beam of radiation that only affects Joao would be way more technologically advanced than anything that was available at the time in the world. Not to mention, why would any government randomly target a Brazilian farmer with this weapon? But Joao would not be the only person in Brazil to die from mysterious rays of light. In the 1970s, so 30 years after Joao's death, several people in a city in northern Brazil reported seeing bright lights coming down from the sky, and then they too began turning purple and their skin began falling off and they would die. And so because of this high number of very strange deaths that looked just like Joao's, a new theory has taken root over the years to explain what happened to Joao and these people. and that is they were attacked by a UFO. That Joel, when he looked out the window and saw that dark figure hovering over the ground, that was a UFO, and the light he saw was a weapon. The UFO was firing a ray of radiation that struck him and killed him, like it struck and killed the others in Brazil. The military actually looked into this theory in 1977 and 1978. It was called Operation Saucer, like flying saucer. However, officially, they came out and said they found no evidence that UFOs were in any way involved in what happened to Joao or these other people. However, many people are skeptical that we're really getting the truth. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please figure out which book the like button is reading currently, and when they're about halfway done with it, spoil the ending.